Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Tuesday, the 6th of January, 2026. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Thanks for joining us. Let's jump inside the Beltway, Robert, starting with this. It's a little bit of an online spat that we saw because basically the Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense / War, came out and said, we're investigating Senator Mark Kelly over this video that they released last year that some claim was seditious. So what's going on?
Good morning, Mike. So yeah, correct. Hegseth did say they initiated with retirement grade determination proceedings against Kelly, and this could lead to post-retirement demotion and a cut to his pension. He said this proceeding was in response to what he called the reckless and seditious video that both Senator Kelly and Senator Alyssa Slotkin participated in. And he said that this was clearly intended to undermine good order and military discipline. Kelly did say he was going to fight the determination proceedings.
So just briefly, when you retire from the military, you are still subject to certain, UCMJ and military regulations as a condition of your retirement and pay. So this is what's being cut. And it's being cut because the administration said this video was seditious. Now, Robert, Mark Kelly and other people would say this video was only intended to discourage members of the military from following illegal orders and did not address or had no effect on what were legal orders. And there was a bunch of people that, we'll leave the debate out, but that's what they say. In the broader context here of Democrats and more broadly, especially the establishment left, building this domestic resistance movement that they could potentially turn into a color revolution in 2028. It sure seems like this was a building block because military and police is the sixth pillar of domestic society that color revolutions target. So this going after Mark Kelly here seems to be discouraging other participation in this resistance and potentially color revolution movement.
I think that's the intent, because this is within the law one avenue that the Trump administration has to target or to retaliate for the video. It's not clear, I think, yet how they're going to respond to the other Democrats who participated in that video. But this is just one part of what I've seen of a larger campaign that includes the billboards that have been put up encouraging troops to question quote illegal orders, and a lot of these legal assistance groups that have been set up that allegedly include former JAG lawyers, with the idea that they would provide legal advice to troops who question Trump's quote illegal orders.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and by the way, a lot of Democrats have been claiming this Venezuela raid was illegal and unconstitutional. I'm sure if Democrats take over the House in the midterms later this year, I'm sure we'll see that's probably impeachment proceedings, or at least impeachment investigations. All right, moving on. Robert, if you're going to have a lot more oil imports coming into the United States, you've got to have deep water ports to bring them in. And this is basically what's happening, correct?
Correct. And this was an announcement from the Department of Transportation. They said that the U.S. Maritime Administration now has sole authority over deep water port permitting. This is under the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the environmental review permits. Normally, this is spread out between multiple agencies. Now they're consolidating it just under one agency. The Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, said that this would allow the administration to accelerate deep water port project approvals. As far as I could find, the U.S. Maritime Administration's latest data from 2021, there were only 3 operating deep water ports, and more than 20 had been proposed and were in some stage of the permitting process, but either withdrew or were denied. And I expect that this is building out infrastructure for the more than 300 billion barrels of Venezuelan oil that are now going to be opened up.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to note that Gulf Coast refineries are capable of refining Venezuelan oil. All right. But because there's light and there's heavy, there's sweet and there's sour, and not all refineries, you can't just dump any kind of oil into a refinery. So they have to be engineered to refine certain types of oil, which the Gulf Coast refiners can do. All right, moving on. I'm with some folks in the chats. The USPS hired unvetted foreign truck drivers.
Yeah, so the United States Postal Service announced yesterday so these are contracted trucking providers. Basically, USPS hires trucking companies to provide the services to move mail between their regional processing centers. And they announced yesterday that they're going to phase out any use of what they call non-domiciled commercial driver's license holders that have not been vetted by the U.S. Postal Inspector. I think this is an important one because I don't think a lot of people knew how prevalent the non-domiciled CDL issue was, but also I think this is leverage over the trucking industry because USPS is a big contract and a government contract, and I think this is going to put more pressure to get rid of the foreign CDL holders.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the non-domiciled CDL means in some cases you can be an illegal immigrant and go to a state like California or New York and get a CDL, a commercial driver's license, so you can drive an 18-wheeler and then go get a job carrying important stuff like mail and official correspondence for USPS.
Correct.
Okay. Amazing. And Robert, you kind of touched on this. This looks like the administration is about to clear out the trucking industry from quote unquote non-domiciled CDLs, i.e. illegal alien truck drivers.
Well, yeah, and there's the ICE and CBP have also been coordinating operations in multiple states to target these foreign CDL holders. The latest one was in California, which was the latest big operation to target these CDL holders. And there's also been at the state level, I think a lot of state and local law enforcement cooperation with this too.
Mm-hmm. All right. Finally, let's move on here over to Canada. This group is based out of Montreal. Is that correct? And they're basically calling for the far left in Canada and potentially elsewhere to target U.S. multinationals. Someone in the chat said, I don't know what a multinational is. Those are companies like McDonald's and banks and whoever, right? U.S. Ostensibly American companies doing business in multinations. All right. Give us the details, Robert.
This is a group is called Organisation Revolutionnaire Anarchists, and they published a call to action for the far left in Canada to target these U.S. multinationals in Montreal in response to the quote kidnapping of Venezuelan President Maduro. They called on these groups to quote do the most brilliant and daring actions the century has seen, and they want them to target fast food chains, tech companies, and defense contractors. Also, part of this call to action, they want the far left responding this to draw inspiration from some of the other direct action demonstrations and direct actions that have taken place overseas, including they specifically called it the UK-based Palestine Action, which has broke into weapon factories in the UK and caused millions of dollars of property damage over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on over to the Global Sit Rep. Starting with an update from Venezuela. Jared, it seems so there's a couple of hurdles here. The Trump administration has to continue negotiations with the current Venezuelan president, and basically they have to negotiate U.S. companies coming back to Venezuela, building out oil infrastructure and other critical infrastructure required for getting Venezuelan oil out of the ground, transported over to ports, loaded onto ships, and then out into the world. So Chevron is leading the charge here, correct?
Yes. And Chevron's able to lead the charge because they're the one company that has maintained operations in Venezuela this entire time. It has been minimal. They only had 20 people working it, but they did maintain it. And they called on those 20 people to come back from their extended holiday break, get restarted. And Chevron intends to maintain these operations, obviously. Now, this is going to give them a head start on actually rebuilding and refurbishing Venezuela's oil infrastructure. One expert I saw, there's a lot of people trying to figure out timelines on this. One expert I saw said that he expects it to take at least 3 years to refurbish the existing infrastructure and 5 to rebuild it, especially if it has to be replaced, is going to take over 5.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like it's going to be very beneficial for the Venezuelan economy, for the construction industry. And I don't know where Venezuela gets its cement from. They probably have domestic producers of all that stuff. But, I mean, we're talking about potentially, I guess, trillions of dollars eventually pouring into Venezuela. I don't know how much all this stuff's going to cost.
Yeah, the estimates I've seen have been in the hundreds of billions. I don't see why it couldn't tip over into at least 1 trillion at some point, just due to the scale of the operations here. And one knock-on effect is this, I think, will help promote stability because it'll provide jobs inside of Venezuela, allowing more legitimacy to be conferred onto the interim government and any follow-on governments.
Hey, just one thing real quick. I didn't necessarily intend to talk about this, but there's a guy on X, and he posted he worked for Cargill, which is an agriculture company, basically a food supplier, and he wrote about his experience in Venezuela. Hang on, Jared, I'll bring it right back. And I just want to go through here and talk about some of the difficulties that he had working for Cargill in Venezuela, basically trying to bring food to these people. And he said it was not necessarily an issue of the people, really an issue of the government. So apparently Cargill had this minute rice facility, and the government basically took over that facility at gunpoint, he says, because the Cargill was accused of gouging the nation's poor people, basically price gouging. And the government came in, they took it over, and they were never able to run the plant. He said it never ran again, and it was returned years later with no equipment inside. Additionally, he talks about the problem of these government-run grocery stores and how they sold staples below the cost that Cargill sold them to the government. And he said, quote, in theory, they used petro oil money to lower grocery prices. Our regular grocery outlets were forced out of business. When the government demanded we sell them products below cost, we simply had to shut down. The populace became ever more dependent on the government handouts. And he says, P.S., this is the mayor of New York City's proposal about these government-run grocery stores. Also, he's talking about the problem of dollars, getting dollars. And apparently there were dollars or have been dollars available, obviously, in Venezuela. I think Venezuela probably sells most of its oil still in dollars somehow. But he says, on the topic of dollars, he says, quote, we needed dollars to go buy raw materials like wheat from places like the U.S. and Canada. So if you're producing bread, you obviously need wheat. He continues, the government would periodically allocate us some dollars that could only be spent for raw materials and freight. Eventually, only the local companies that could and would pay bribes got dollar allocations. We had several facilities closed for lack of raw material. I'm going to put this link in the chat. It's over on X if you want to read it. It's pretty interesting. But that just provides a little bit of detail about how difficult it is to run a business when you are literally trying to feed the people of this country. How difficult it is to do that under a communist dictatorship. I'll post it in the chat for everyone here. Sorry, this is only going to show up on YouTube and then our streaming platform. Interesting read. You should go read it. All right, Jared, let's move on. Brazil is sending some medical aid to Venezuela.
Yes, they're going to stand up an operation there. It's involving equipment, medicines, and personnel for an actual distribution center there in Venezuela, and they are prepared to increase if the situation calls for it. I do expect they will increase their presence there. Moving over next door to Colombia, Senator Ivan Cepeda said, which he's a leftist presidential candidate for the Colombian presidential election this May.
Yeah, so just briefly, he is in the same leftist party as the current president, Petro. Go ahead.
He is reportedly leading in Colombia's polls, and he accused President Trump yesterday of trying to influence this year's elections through what he called slander, insults, or threats. The threats being, hey, we're, I'm okay with running the same operation on Petro. Now, Cepeda also claims that Colombia is not a protectorate of the United States, which I think is very interesting considering they are a major non-NATO ally, which confers protectorate status directly to Colombia.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is interesting for a few reasons. Number one, because I'm sure the Colombians have been observing what happened in Honduras, where you have a very tight race between a left-wing and a right-wing candidate. And the right wing just barely eked out, I think maybe about 1%, eked out a victory. But even then, there are accusations and I guess ongoing investigations. Xiomara Castro, who's the president of Honduras, accused President Trump, or at least accused the Trump administration of basically meddling in their election, trying to tip the scales to ensure that the right-wing nationalist candidate would win. I imagine, well, I mean, Cepeda, I'm sure this is not the first time he said this, but I imagine if it is a close race, and the Colombia's presidential elections are in May, and also they have parliamentary elections in March. But if these are close races and a center-right or right-wing candidate who apparently are not polling real well, although there are many of them, and so some of that support's going to consolidate, obviously. But if a right-wing candidate does win, we'll almost certainly see accusations. And the question that I have is, Honduras is going through this investigation. It does not appear to me that there's going to be a left-wing takeover of the country to prevent a right-wing president from taking over. TBA, frankly. I would say the risk is much greater in Colombia because Gustavo Petro was getting very cozy with Maduro, and he sure seems to have that leftist dictator strain in him. He's also a former M19 revolutionary fighter as well. So something that we will keep an eye on. So thanks for that update, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to the Asia Pacific region.
Yep. So a couple quick notes out of China. As of this morning, China restricted the export of all dual-use items for military end users purposes or any other end users that contribute in any way to enhancing Japan's military readiness. This is coming out of the Ministry of Commerce there. And when the foreign ministry there was asked about whether they'd recognize the interim government for Venezuela under Delcy Rodriguez, who was just the vice president, now is president, the foreign ministry said they would respect the arrangements made by the Venezuelan government, and she took over constitutionally for the Venezuelans. So I think what we're seeing here is the primary adversary of the United States is giving recognition to the government that the United States, I won't say installed, but at least helped come to power.
Mm-hmm. All right. Jared, quick question on this topic of China cutting off dual-use items to Japan. Okay, that's obviously not going to be things like microwaves, but biotech, medical stuff. I mean, if China, and I don't know how much of the stuff China actually makes, but let's just say, for instance, there's some medical imaging device that we're going to export to Japan for civilian medical purposes, but could also be used for military medical purposes. That would be an example of a dual-use item that is now basically banned by China.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yes. China's dual-use definitions are incredibly broad. Particularly that contribute in any way. Basically, that opens up to any material that could potentially be used, from food all the way to missile components. It is broad enough that they could just shut down trade with Japan at any time, and they have these the dual-use export restrictions on the books for everybody.
Mm-hmm. All right. So where I'm going with this is in terms of the weight of this indicator. I mean, this absolutely is an early warning indicator of conflict, because at a certain point you say the risk of war with Japan is too great if you're China, and you say, yeah, we pretty much got to start cutting them off just because the risk is rising, and the risk has been rising over many years now. Say on a scale of 1 to 10 or maybe 1 to 5, how important is this as an early warning indicator of conflict? 5, or we'll say 10. 10 being imminent. This is of extreme importance. 5 is pretty baseline. These are kind of things that we expect them to do in the years leading up to a conflict, not necessarily something that's going to start next week.
I'd say probably a 6, because they are looking to, it's not, oh, we're cutting off some, we're cutting off these under this. No, we are cutting off all dual use. And the only reason it's not higher than a 6 is that they can also expand that definition. They can further fill that definition, say, keep rolling things back from there.
So they can
and
continue
in addition to
adding
that,
things to their export restrictions list to Japan. So this is kind of a foot in the door kind of thing.
And a contributing factor to that is also the fact that they still have not resolved the diplomatic spat from when Takaichi said that Japan would be open to coming to Taiwan's aid in the event of a Taiwan contingency. Mm-hmm. So all of that's they're going to feed into each other and worsen the situation here.
Mm-hmm. Remember, there's a really great book by John Copeland. It's called Economic Interdependence and War. And one of the main observation from this book is when you have economically interdependent countries, when one or both of those countries develops negative future trade expectations, when they believe that trade is going to break down in the future, one side is going to be incentivized to protect itself. And he says typically that leads to war. Something like 90% going back to the 1700s. Copeland said, I think it's like 90% of the time that leads to conflict when you have great powers that are economically interdependent. And yeah, maybe Japan's not necessarily a great power, obviously, on the global stage, but regionally, they certainly are. And so keep that. I would just say there's a lot of history that shows these two countries are probably heading to war at some point. The book title, again, is Economic Interdependence and War, appropriately titled. All right. Thanks, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to our Homeland Ops brief. Lots to cover also. Robert, DHS announced that they have it's a pretty sizable expansion now.
Correct. This is more than twice the amount of current ICE agents and officers. They announced that they hired 12,000 new ICE agents and officers over the last year, and this has increased the size of ICE from credential agents by 120%. They said thousands of these new ICE officers are already deployed nationwide to support some of these federal immigration operations. And one of those that is expanding is Operation Metro Surge. Some of the local law enforcement officials said that DHS is deploying up to 2,000 additional federal agents and officers in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and that this deployment began on Sunday. Also, CBP official Greg Bovino is expected to oversee this operation, which is an indicator that this is going to be a major ramp up. And this will include a lot of what we saw in Chicago, Charlotte, and New Orleans, which are things like presence patrols and a lot more raids. This is, as far as I can tell, the largest deployment yet. And I think this is going to be a good example of where these future federal surges are going when it comes to scope and size. Because previously in Chicago, in Los Angeles, New Orleans, and in Charlotte, North Carolina, it was, from what I could find, it was mostly in the low hundreds of agents deployed, between 300 and 500. This is a significantly larger amount of agents. And this is, as far as I can tell, also a direct response to the allegations of fraud ongoing for HUD in Minnesota, which I think the Trump administration is leveraging to basically give them an opening in public opinion to expand these federal surges. And
Robert, I'll let you finish the thought. I do have a question about these ICE agents. Go ahead.
And then I think if we see this expected surge into Phoenix, Arizona, it will be, I think, on this scale. It will be, I think, likely much more than a few hundred agents deployed, especially because they're building one of those warehouse mega detention centers only a few miles from Phoenix.
Mm-hmm. All right, so DHS came out and said ICE has hired 12,000 new ICE agents. I'm not saying that's not the case, but I will tell you, late last year, like probably October, November, I talked to a viewer of the show, a subscriber who works out of the DC field office for ICE, or I guess the ICE ERO office. And I read a report in Politico that 1/3 of all potential new ICE hires weren't able to be hired because they failed either PT test. I don't know if ICE has height and weight, but basically they're too fat or too out of shape to go work for ICE. The military basically has a program where they will take recruits and get them to lose enough weight so that they can at least make entry level height and weight requirements. And obviously, ideally they're passing PT tests before they go to basic training. I don't know if ICE has that, but that was a big 1/3 of all ICE applicants weren't able to be hired because of that. And now ICE said that they have not only hired 10,000 new ICE agents, but 12,000. Just last week or the past couple weeks, ICE said that they were going to have a wartime recruitment drive because they were trying to get more recruits, and they were going to target military veterans and go do advertising at NASCAR and all these other places where they are getting in front of what you might call their target audience for employment recruitment. This seems like a high number to me, Robert, frankly. 12,000, maybe it's not unbelievable, but it seems like that happened very quickly.
I don't think these are all 12,000 that are currently on duty. I think this is a mix of people in different steps of the recruitment process and in the process of heading to FLETC, or the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Because I do know of one person who has been hired by ICE here in Florida, and they're currently basically reporting to the local ICE office in Orlando before heading to FLETC. So they are hired officially, but they have not gone through training and been deployed yet.
Mm-hmm. All right, FLETC being the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I guess what most are all federal agents, all federal law enforcement agents probably go through FLETC.
I think most
Actual
do.
agents.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, correct. And it's a mix of different agencies, but some have their own training programs. I believe that, some do go through FLETC at some phase, but then like Customs and Border Protection has their own program as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's follow up on that. It seems high, but also if they do have 12,000 hires and some portion of them are obviously going through FLETC at an expanded rate, probably very similar to the ramp up, what we saw basic and AIT ramp up in the mid 2000s in response to the demands of the Iraq war, basically just funneling as many recruits through there as they could. Another reason why this matters, and this is hugely important, but guys, this is the reason why we are building this OSINT platform. And Rob is going to have this up for beta testing up on Thursday, he says, our CTO. The reason why we are building this open source intelligence platform, and we want it to be the best available for Americans, for the consumer users of intelligence, is in March, these protests are going to ramp up. Just like we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, wherever you have a larger American footprint in those countries, you will have a greater amount of insurgent activity. There's not a lot of insurgent activity, at least observable, going on in areas where there were no troops. I was sitting in a meeting one time, and it was by Lieutenant Colonel, whatever task force it was, and this second lieutenant, this MI, military intelligence officer, and this was when I was a contractor. He gets up there and he says, "Sir, here's a picture of all the ID strikes over the past 48 or 72 hours or whatever." And he says, this is where the insurgents are most active. And or he said something like, "Oh, this is where we assess the insurgents are most active." And, it should not take a rocket scientist, being that was in 2012, roughly, maybe 2011. And we'd had many years of doing this. It's not that the insurgents were necessarily the most active there. You had the most ID strikes there because that's where all the Americans were. You don't get ID strikes where we're not driving down the road, maybe obviously on civilians or something like that. Some kid hits an ID obviously in a footpath. But the whole point is that I'm trying to make is once ICE expands their operational footprint and they go into more cities, we are necessarily going to see an increase in resistance against them. Next, I'm not saying that we're going to have summer of love. It is going to be extremely contentious next year, not only with the lead up to the midterms and obviously a lot of fallout after that, but beginning in March, we're going to see these protests ramp up, the spring offensive, and as ICE continues to deploy hundreds of agents across the country, it's coming to a city near you. We'll say that. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Thanks for standing by. Let's move on.
And over in Minneapolis yesterday, DHS claimed that a Minneapolis, Minnesota hotel maliciously canceled all their reservations that they made for ICE and DHS agents as part of this Operation Metro Surge deployment. The DHS said the cancellations were the result of a coordinated campaign by Hilton Hotels to refuse service to DHS. Hilton Hotels said that this hotel is independently operated and owned and that they apologized for the cancellations. While this was resolved, I think it's still important to point out that this could have been the result of a pressure campaign on a local business, because that is something that activists, especially in Chicago, have been attempting to use as a leverage over local businesses to get them to not do business with ICE and CBP agents. One of the bigger examples in Chicago was the targeting of national car rental companies through pressure campaigns. And some of the hotels, I think in Minneapolis as well, have been targeted with direct action noise protests, direct action demonstrations, the idea of deterring these hotels from doing business with ICE. And Robert, I think we're likely to see more of this. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. They love doing noise demonstrations. One of the problems that I've seen with these noise demonstrations is they go on all night and they're targeted towards the side of the hotel where they think the ICE officers are trying to sleep. So they're trying to keep these ICE officers up all night. Local law enforcement is not arresting any of these people for disturbing the peace or whatever they could arrest them for. Obviously, not all law enforcement, but in the cities that I have seen, it's like these guys are out there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, beating on drums and yelling through the bullhorns and what mariachi bands, whoever, whatever they have out there. And I would be extremely angry if law enforcement were not doing anything about it. So this is going to be another problem, obviously endemic, which is where you have oppositional politics in the city where you're operating, and law enforcement is really not only are they not cooperating with what you're trying to do, in some cases they may be aiding and abetting that resistance, which is a problem, obviously.
Well, and Portland is one of the best examples of that, I think, where the Portland PD were ordered, as far as I could tell, not to arrest for any disturbing the peace during that direct action demonstration outside of the detention facility, which was near multiple residential areas, and that ended up leading to a lawsuit against the city. And the judge struck it down, saying that basically they aren't required to enforce any kind of noise ordinances or anything like that. Of course, Portland reversed that when they were heading into that lawsuit over National Guard troop deployments. But that is one of the things local governments have been doing in these blue cities to resist the Trump administration is, one, allowing these types of protests to happen, and then two, when they are prepared to maneuver legally against the Trump administration, then going in and clearing out to create the perception that there is no resistance.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Jared, excuse me, Robert, just on that topic briefly, what recourse does the Department of Justice have? And I ask that because you remember back during the Obama administration, there was a county in Alabama and maybe some other southern counties where the DOJ came in and said, you have racist white police officers in these black communities, and we're going to come observe you. And DOJ, whoever was embedded in these sheriff's offices or police departments looking for infractions, presumably they could be charged by the DOJ for, I don't know, whatever amendment it would be. And what recourse does this DOJ have in a city like Portland or Seattle or Phoenix or somewhere else where law enforcement is actively aiding and abetting what is illegal disruption of federal law enforcement operations? Anything?
So constitutionally, the states have police powers. So technically, the federal government's not allowed to reach down and tell the states how to conduct law enforcement. However, the Obama and Biden administrations used consent decrees, which technically those local law enforcement agencies are agreeing to. That is maybe a mechanism the Trump administration can use. Is effectively they're going to engage in consent decrees to enforce these, local ordinances and state laws that would allow them to arrest the far left and progressive and democratic socialist direct action demonstrators, especially for like breaking local ordinances. And the leverage they would have there would be federal dollars and grants that go to local and state law enforcement agencies, because those local and state law enforcement agencies, like almost every state government, has become very dependent on these federal funds.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Would the House have to get involved then at that point if they have appropriated certain funds for these departments?
I don't think so. They didn't have to under Obama and Biden administrations. And I think it's because of the consent decrees that they entered into with these local and state law enforcement agencies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And on the anything else to add here?
No.
Okay. Great. You haven't seen this slide for a while because things have been pretty mopey, pretty slow, frankly. However, we do have over 100 protests scheduled for today. That is over double what it usually is. We normally see 30 to 50, like 40 is pretty average for any given day of the week, especially on a Tuesday. There's over 100 today. And, Jared, before we started, I looked at this map and I said, oh, well, most of these are obviously, they must just be anti or pro-Venezuela, anti-Trump protests. And actually, no, these are J6 protests. They're still protesting about the alleged insurrection from 2021.
Yes. Yes. I went there and it seemed like every third, fourth one was, oh, never forget January 6th. Just all about the anniversary today.
Mm-hmm. Project 2029 is going to make this a national holiday. People are going to get the day off of work, and we're going to light candles and hold hands and sing songs to memorialize J6. All right. With that, I think we do have some questions here. Listen, we have a lot of questions from yesterday that we will try to get through, and a lot of them are about Venezuela. Let's just see what we got. Should Venezuela or Cuba experience a collapse in government and basic public services? We answered this question already. Is the call to prayer actually being blasted out 5 times a day in Manhattan? I think in many cases it is being blasted out 5 times a day wherever a mosque is. Maybe there are certain city ordinances, but Robert, do you have anything?
No, as far as I know, it's where we have a heavy Muslim presence.
Okay. All right. That song's annoying, by the way. All right. Venezuela's full administration. And listen, and I say this because on my very first deployment, I heard this 5 times, almost 5 times a day. I wasn't there 24/7, but I worked in an interrogation facility. And so they had their little moms down there screaming the call to prayer. And it's annoying. All right. Venezuela's full administration, including their Supreme Court, will need to be revamped. New people put into power in order to get rid of the Maduro regime. Do you see this happening in an orderly manner? Or, well, Robert, I guess this is the Bukele solution for Venezuela? El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, has basically told Trump in no uncertain terms repeatedly, numerous times, you have to go through and you've got to clear the courts because it is basically judicial tyranny, is what Bukele would say, where just some random federal judge can stop what the Trump administration is doing just with a stroke of a pen or a strike of a gavel. And it sure seems like you would expect a communist country is obviously going to stack the courts in their favor. Is basically we're looking at the entire remake of the Venezuelan government potentially.
From what I understand, that Secretary of State Marco Rubio and everyone involved in this decision, including Stephen Miller, I think last night in some interviews, their goal is actually not regime change. It's more something like regime acquiescence. That was the goal, apparently, of the extradition, or the extraordinary rendition of President Maduro. And as far as I can tell, they're all working with the current government with the idea that if they do something that the Trump administration doesn't like, well, they're going to kidnap the next president, or they're going to maybe even extraordinarily rendition and some other government official. Mm-hmm. I think this is actually, as far as they've said, that the point of this is to avoid getting mired in a regime change operation that could lead to an insurgency.
Mm-hmm. The best case scenario for Venezuela, apparently elections are obviously not coming in the next 30 days. Trump has already said that. 30 days is too soon to hold national elections. I don't know when, but I guess probably in the next couple of years, there will be elections. The best case scenario is that there are free and fair elections, and the Venezuelan people said, yeah, we actually don't want more communism. We want less. And they elect a moderate or maybe a nationalist candidate, and the communists, I think you would basically, the big risk is that they don't go willingly, especially because here, I'm not saying that there will be, but in a lot of these countries where you have these kind of regime changes or very swift kind of political revolutions, you have these things called like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where they go through and they look at war crimes, or they look at civil rights violations. They look at all the instances of tyrannical behavior. And this is also very common across Latin America just because there's been so many dictators. But they go through and they do these investigations, and they investigate and charge people for, you killed my family member, you did X, Y, or Z 5 or 10 years ago. And so it sure, like the de-Baathification of Iraq or the denazification of Germany, it sure seems like there would probably have to be a de-Maduroification of Venezuela for Venezuela to be a first world country, probably again.
Well, I think one of the stated goals of the Trump corollary is obviously to push Chinese, Russian influence, Iranian influence, even out of Venezuela. But I think the less vociferously stated point of the Trump corollary is to stabilize a lot of these countries. In Venezuela, I think right now stabilization is basically triage, making sure or influencing the current government, the current regime to allow food imports, to allow industry reindustrialization of their food industry, their oil industry, with the idea of stabilizing the country. And if they take steps like Maduro and Chavez did before him to destabilize for regime security purposes, that includes putting the military in a position where they can't conduct a coup, basically hogging resources for regime friends. I think that is what the Trump administration is telling the people that are still in the Venezuelan government not to do. That they need to reverse a lot of these policies with the implied threat that they will conduct another Delta operation to rendition another official.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we have the demonstrated capability. I guess that's always going to be a risk for leaders of Venezuela who basically don't want to do what the United States is doing, who do not do what the United States wants. And listen, this is kind of tough for me to say because really, I mean, ideally, everyone should just be like a small L libertarian. And if we were a religious and moral people and we all had above room temperature IQs, we could have a very high trust, high functioning society where we did not need a lot of exertion of authority, or maybe minimal authority, maybe even no authority in terms of like centralized government. However, I say this because a lot of people have correctly pointed out, they're coming around to correctly pointing out there's simply no such thing as international law anymore. And the Russians have violated it, the Chinese are violating it, and now the United States is violating it. And you look at basically the realpolitik people who see the world as it is, not as they want it to be, and you say, yeah, this is the historical norm across all of known recorded human history. Might makes right. And under this post-1945 rules-based international order, it wasn't necessarily might makes right, but it was the might of the United States makes the law. And we had laws because you could enforce them. And I don't think the United States is in a position anymore to enforce all those laws, certainly not to enforce the global order. The Europeans cannot defend themselves. Our allies in Asia Pacific, for the most part, I mean, they can enforce their borders and sovereignty, but they could not defend themselves against large-scale combat operations or, potentially from China. They would at least have a struggle. So at any rate, I'm just saying we're reverting to the historic mean where you have, if you're a small country, you're a small, weak country, you are going to depend on a regional power that is larger and more powerful than you. And that has been the case throughout all of human history. We have lived through an aberrant part of history. The post-1945 world order was an aberration. It is not coming back, certainly not under multipolarity. The best you can hope for is a secure United States that is secure because we secure our neighbors with whom we cooperate. And you look at the national security strategy, you look at what is almost certainly the future of the Western Hemisphere, and there is no reason why we cannot have a very bright future. A lot of things are going to have to be done, and some things that might violate international law. But I think that's where we're headed, and you don't have to like it. It's just probably what's going to happen, because I don't think there's any stopping a reversion to the historic mean. Maybe in the future, maybe once we solve a lot of these problems, maybe we can have this traditional republic, small r, Republican society. Maybe we can go back to being a republic at some point. I don't know. Maybe if you want to live in a republic, you're just going to have to go to Mars and live in Musk world, Muscovia. I don't know. But what I do know is in order for us to secure the Western Hemisphere, the United States is necessarily going to have to bend foreign countries to our will. And we did that sometimes under international consensus during the rules-based international order. It is obviously not going to happen with international consensus anymore. With that, let's go ahead and move on. It's a certainty that Maduro loyalists run the political machine for Venezuelan courts. We kind of already answered this question. How long till we get that oil? Jared, you said 3 to 5 years for existing infrastructure to be repaired and new infrastructure to be built. I would say that sounds kind of rosy to me. But potentially we could see U.S. refineries within a couple of years start to receive Venezuelan oil.
Well, there are oil operations. It is just not a lot compared to what it is.
Well,
so I would say we start getting it probably as soon as oil companies return there. But actually getting it in full, 3 to 5 years at minimum. I'll leave it there.
Okay. All right, we'll do a couple more questions here that we have not already covered. Yeah, let's cover this from yesterday. Redemption says AI chips will be like oil. This is what China wanted. Now they can take over Taiwan. 90% of chips come from Taiwan. All right, Jared, let's go ahead and break this down. It's a lot easier to move chip production out of Taiwan than it is to move oil, sustained oil into China. Let's go ahead and say that. TSMC, these Taiwanese officials, they've already said they're simply going to destroy these factories if the Chinese do take over. And that's it. And there's also, I'm sure there are contingency plans made, led by the United States, to get those engineers and scientists out of Taiwan before the ball drops. So when you see TSMC employees disappear from Taipei or wherever they are, that should be a pretty good sign. When they're getting on aircraft, it should be a pretty good sign that some stuff's about to pop off. Jared, this is not what China wanted. China did not want to lose their a key ally and major point of leverage in the Western Hemisphere. Simply did not want that. Correct.
Yeah. There's so much to come out of this. So, speaking on just the semiconductors and TSMC, we are already seeing the very earliest signals of that when Taiwan is they've considered removing the law mandating that only the second generation chips, like one generation behind, can be made elsewhere. The fact that they're even talking about that shows that they're taking that seriously enough, and that it would be moving people out at that point. Now, as far as China, I would contest that China can even take over Taiwan. We've discussed that pretty in depth, particularly now out of Venezuela, as more and more information comes out of this. They're going to have to do a technology review, make sure that all of their stuff actually even works appropriately. I think that pushes them well past 2027 and into their demographic cliff.
Yeah. One more part of this claim that China's just going to roll into Taiwan and take over TSMC and start making these 2 nanometer chips is they require a very pure form of, I think it's quartz crystal, some kind of crystal that is mined in exactly one place in the entire world, and it is in North Carolina. The Chinese will simply not be able to produce the same quality of chips that TSMC can currently, because we are obviously not going to ship that quartz over to China. So, Jared, I think those are some myths that still need to be dispelled, and I'm sure we'll do that again. All right, Robert, briefly, if Trump invokes the Insurrection Act, how does he implement that when the Dems would sue him if he sneezes? Well, I would expect if the Trump administration were to invoke the Insurrection Act, they would do so on firm grounds. And I'm sure you will have some federal judge that says, no, actually, you can't invoke the Insurrection Act. By the way, guys, maybe the administration is forced into it. Maybe they feel that they're forced into it. Maybe they think that there's some political advantage to doing that, but the left is going to go berserk, and this is not going to be over soon. And we'll be living under the Insurrection Act for a long, long time, like potentially years or longer, if this were to happen. That is, that may be actually, potentially, that may actually be a Rubicon moment. We'll see. At any rate, Robert, presumably this would be escalated up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would say, yeah, actually, he can invoke the Insurrection Act, or no, he actually cannot here.
I think it's
basically how
likely
it's going to go. Yeah.
correct. And I think it's likely they side with the administration. So Trump's 48% number that he's been throwing around for a couple months now is a little inaccurate. It's really closer to about a third of administrations have invoked the Insurrection Act at some point. And I think there's probably.
Oh, sorry. Hang on. Sorry, but throw that last sentence by me one more time.
So Trump has said, well, 48% of presidents have invoked the Insurrection Act. That's not exactly accurate, but about a third of the administrations have from the beginning of the country. And
from the beginning of the country, 1/3 of presidents have invoked the Insurrection Act. Okay, I didn't know that.
For some reason or another, a lot of times over riots, strikes, a couple of times, like Grover Cleveland, which Trump has already followed the example of by winning non-consecutive terms, also invoked the Insurrection Act twice over riots and work strikes out west. And so I think there's pretty strong precedent for the Trump administration invoking the Insurrection Act, depending on the argument they make for doing so.
The justification.
And the Supreme Court has already said, well, regular forces, is the only time that he can federalize National Guard troops. I think that's kind of for the conservative side of the court that agreed with that ruling, opening the door to this. And I think they have a really good chance of actually siding with the Trump administration. It's not unprecedented. The last time it was invoked was during the HW administration and the LA riots, but that's 1/3 of administrations have done so for one justification or another. I think he has a greater than 50% chance of winning.
Okay. That was the 92 Rodney King riots.
Correct.
Okay. Very interesting, Robert. Thanks for sharing that with us. All right, we'll do maybe one or two other questions. Actually, Jared, can you pull a good question from today? I think we're still on yesterday's questions, unfortunately. How sharp of an escalation do you guys expect if and when POTUS invokes the Insurrection Act? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the justification. But listen, guys, there's over 2,000 indivisible chapters in this country. And I know they said they got like 7 million people to turn out for the last No Kings last October. I don't believe that. Maybe 5 million. But still, those are 5. And I think that is a legit number, 5 million. And so at a minimum, we will probably see protests of 5 million, maybe even more. So I'm not saying this will happen. But I don't expect the Insurrection Act to be invoked prior to the midterms. I think that could potentially be disastrous. But you also, so I think it's probably more likely than not to come after the midterms if it comes. And 2028 is going to be an extremely tumultuous year. And we could see it come that year. And remember, the reason why I've been calling this now a resistance movement rather than a protest movement is because we're broadly looking at this 3 phases. And I've explained this multiple times for most of last year in a bunch of videos explain this, but briefly we'll cover it again. The 3 phases are protest, resistance, revolution. Protest is what we saw in 2025. Getting in a little bit to resistance, there was actually quite a bit of resistance, but nothing on the level that we will see this year and in subsequent years. And the reason why you start with protest before you move to resistance is because you want mass appeal. This is the whole thing. They want mass action. And so you've got to have tactics that appeal to a mass amount of people. And protests appeal to pretty much everyone on the left. It is kind of a national pastime for them, protest. And then once you build this massive base of protesters, then you can escalate. Because remember, you cannot sustain any kind of escalation unless you have broad-based support for it. And so by having this massive pool of protesters, they're able to then take people who, there are going to be protesters who say, I don't want to be arrested. I don't want to be anywhere near this stuff. But then you will have people who say, yeah, I'm willing to be arrested for whatever. And that is when you start turning protest action into direct action demonstrations, into intervention. Not just, I don't like these policies, but I don't like these policies and I'm going to do something about it. We're going to go do an occupation. We're going to chain ourselves to whatever. We're going to lay down in the street. We're going to try to blockade an ICE facility. We're going to try to impede federal law enforcement vehicles while they're out in the community conducting these immigration enforcement operations. That is we have obviously seen some of that, but that is coming in a much larger scale this year. So you have the base of your pyramid is protest, and then the people who want to escalate, you escalate them into resistance. And what that is going to do in turn, this is going to become cyclical, which is increased resistance means increased federal law enforcement attention and increased federal law enforcement action. And if you are the resistance, it is incumbent on you to credibly, or I would say maybe even not, sometimes not even credibly, but you have to reinforce this narrative that your peaceful protesters, or your rather nonviolent protesters, not just peaceful, but nonviolent protesters, and that you're being attacked by this fascist dictatorial regime. And if you can get 20, 30, 40+% of Americans to believe that, then you will be building a narrative that is required to go from resistance to revolution, depending on the outcome of the 2028 election. This is where the color revolution actually gets in. So what we're living through now is the building blocks of the color revolution being protest and resistance. If a Democrat wins in November 28, they don't need a color revolution. If a Republican wins, or if Democrats can credibly contest the 2028 election outcome, where J.D. Vance or whoever wins, they've already got this massive national protest and resistance movement numbering in they say 3.5%. That's the Erica Chenoweth number, 3.5%. That's what they say. It's 11 million Americans or so. So that's what they need. They've got to have 11 million Americans come out and directly oppose the election results, or come out and directly oppose the Trump administration. It is a lot easier to move from resistance to revolution than it is from protest to revolution. That's why you've got to have this mid phase of, it's not quite revolutionary, but it's definitely not protest. That is why this second phase is so crucial for them to build and sustain. And they cannot do that unless they have broad base of support for doing this. This is what we're going to see from the beginning here of 2026 all the way through the end of 28. My expectation, remember, whenever we're looking at probabilities, what's the probability that X event will occur in the future? You always start with the baseline. How frequently has this occurred in the past? You just heard Robert say 1/3 of U.S. presidential administrations have invoked the Insurrection Act for one reason or another. Okay. Let's just call that roughly 33%. Roughly 33%. I don't know. Robert, do you have an exact number or exact percentage there?
I don't have an exact percentage. It's basically about 15 out of 47.
Okay. So a third. Well, 15 out of 47 is not. Okay. Less than a third. All right. Oh, actually, I'm dumb. That is pretty close to a third because it's 15 out of 45. Okay. Thanks. Math. Okay. So a third of the time. A third of the administrations. Let me get back on track here. You start with a baseline. Yep. Sorry, guys. I don't know. I don't remember exactly where I was going. My bad. All right, let's go ahead and move on. We'll do one more question. Do you think, so again, I apologize for that. Do you think patriot groups will start forming to combat the anti-ICE demonstrations and protesters? Well, I think we already have seen some counter demonstrations from conservative groups. I don't think they certainly have not been widespread. There is a case to be made that if you're trying to counter a color revolution, remember, if you're on the color revolutionary side, you want optics and you want narrative. And when you get millions of Americans pouring into the streets, calling for the current president to step down, or calling for election results to be overturned because they were stolen, or at least that's what they will accuse, then you have the optics of, this is a mass demonstration. Most of America is against the election outcome, or most of America believes that the election was stolen and that the results have to be overturned. So there is a case where counter demonstrations potentially are required to combat that narrative, where you have millions of Americans coming out in defense of the election results, or coming out in support of the presidential administration, calling for him to remain in office And potentially, we could potentially get there. But that stuff's probably not going to be happening until after the midterms. All right, guys, that's going to do it here. Sorry, I don't remember. I had a second point I was going to make about establishing baseline. When you're looking at the likelihood of a future event happening, you start with the baseline, and then basically what you do is you look for factors that could cause that trigger, and then you look for conditions that would make that trigger less likely. And there's some other tools you can use, like Bayesian analysis, to determine likelihood. At any rate, we appreciate your support. Thanks for being here. Thanks for spending your morning with us. That's going to do it here for our report. And listen, Thursday, we're going to have this new OSINT platform out. We're going to start putting beta testers in there over late this week, over the weekend, and throughout next week. And then basically, once we get all the kinks worked out, I mean, I think the platform is pretty much ready to go. This is more like kind of user experience. Like, let's talk about features that we have versus features that you want and we don't have. And then that'll probably take a couple weeks, and then we'll get that up for all users. If you want to go ahead, head over to forwardobserver.com. That's our website if you've never been there. forwardobserver.com/trial. Sign up for a free 7-day trial. You get a copy of our written report in your inbox every morning. And then you'll be a member ready to go once we move our member database over to this new platform, and you get access to all the tools in there. All right, everyone, thanks so much for your support. That's going to do it for us here today. Hope you have a great rest of your day. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.